Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a totally fascinating political thought experiment. We're talking about national debt, government spending, and above all else, accountability. Let's be real, true fiscal accountability can feel incredibly rare these days, right? So often, politicians make these grand, sweeping promises, spend heavily to fund them, and then quietly retire from public life long before the actual bill comes due. But what if we could somehow change that? We're exploring a concept that takes an idea originally proposed by the legendary American investor Warren Buffett and attempts to adapt it to the unique political machinery of Australia. It's a really interesting exploration of how we might theoretically enforce strict, inescapable fiscal discipline on the very people who hold the national purse strings.
So what happens when you attach immediate personal consequences to political spending? I want you to keep that question right in the back of your mind as we walk through this thought experiment. This sets the stage perfectly for a remarkably blunt proposal for fiscal responsibility put forward by Buffett. His main point is actually incredibly simple. If you genuinely want to change how politicians handle the nation's finances, you literally have to make the consequences of bad financial management entirely personal and intensely immediate.
Section 1. Buffett's Radical Fix, the original premise.
Let's look at the original premise that sparked this whole thing and see exactly what was proposed. If we did a direct translation of Buffett's idea and applied it to the Australian federal parliament, specifically the House of Representatives, the lower house where government is formed and where budgets actually originate, the rule would read something like this. If Australia's federal budget deficit exceeds 3% of GDP, all sitting MPs in the House of Representatives become ineligible for re-election. Just pause and think about the sheer psychological impact of that for a second. Imagine being a lawmaker. You might really want to fund a massive new infrastructure project, or maybe hand out sweeping tax cuts to win some favor. But if the overall national math fails and a deficit crosses that line, boom, you lose your job instantly. That kind of fear focuses the mind incredibly fast. Now, in the United States, Buffett's idea directly targets lawmakers because Congress controls spending, completely separately from the president. If Congress spends too much, Congress gets fired. It's clean, it's direct, and it surgically targets the exact people writing the checks.
Section 2. The Westminster system, the complication.
Bringing this idea across the Pacific isn't just a simple copy and paste job, because we immediately hit a massive structural roadblock. In the U.S. system, there's a strict separation of powers. The lawmakers who draft the budget are largely separate from the executive branch that signs it. But Australia uses a Westminster parliamentary system. It's a fused system. The executive branch, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, is literally embedded right within the legislature itself. And in this system, cabinet discipline is incredibly tight. Backbenchers almost never vote against their own party's budget. Plus, in Australia, the government automatically falls if it loses the confidence of the lower house or if it can't pass supply, which basically means passing the budget. Because of this deep interconnectedness, just firing all the individual members of parliament doesn't neatly address the actual power dynamics of who truly drives the national deficit down under.
Section 3. The Canberra Clause, designing the rule. So, since we can't just broadly target all lawmakers like the U.S. model suggests, we've got to identify the real centers of power in the Australian system to make this thought experiment actually work. The true Australian equivalent of Buffett's rule would logically need to target one of three entities. Number 1, the governing party as a whole. Number 2, the treasurer, who directly oversees the federal budget. Or number 3, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet specifically. These are the people genuinely driving the fiscal agenda, making the hard calls, and negotiating the trade-offs in a Westminster system. Let's workshop this. A true Australian adaptation might look a bit like this. If the Commonwealth deficit exceeds 3% of GDP for 2 consecutive years outside a recession, the government automatically triggers an election. Notice how this is a much more natively Australian-style version. It leans right into the existing parliamentary mechanism of triggering elections. Instead of just firing individual MPs, it holds the entire governing party collectively accountable to the voting public. If they fail to maintain a manageable deficit during normal non-recession times, well, they have to go back to the people and justify their spending choices immediately.
Or actually, we could look at a slightly different formulation. How about the Treasurer and Cabinet become ineligible to serve another term if debt to GDP rises above a fixed threshold? This version is highly surgical. Instead of forcing a massive general election that disrupts everyone, it directly punishes the executive leadership. It effectively ends the specific political careers of the Treasurer and the Cabinet members if they breach that fiscal limit. It pinpoints the true architects of the budget. Either of these adaptations absolutely achieves the core goal, directly targeting the ultimate decision-makers within a fused system and forcing them to own the consequences of their balance sheets.
Section 4. Incentive problem, the core issue.
Okay, Let's shift our focus from the mechanics of the rule to the underlying philosophy. Why even propose such a drastic measure in the first place? Well, the crucial point boils down to the incentive structure. Currently, the whole dynamic dictates that politicians benefit immensely from spending money right now, whether that means funding popular infrastructure programs, cutting taxes, or handing out lucrative grants. The immediate political reward is huge, but the consequences of all that borrowing, they arrive years, sometimes decades later. Often this happens long after the politicians who actually sign those checks have comfortably retired from public office. So you see, the core idea of Buffett's proposal isn't actually about punishment. It's about alignment. It's specifically designed to force short-term political actions to perfectly align with long-term economic realities. And it does that by attaching an inescapable, immediate personal cost to long-term fiscal irresponsibility.
And here's the kicker. Because of Australia's specific electoral environment, this concept might actually bite much, much harder politically than it ever would in the United States. First off, there's compulsory voting. In a system where everyone has to show up to the polls, a governing party can't just rely on firing up a narrow, highly partisan base to scrape through an election after blowing up the deficit. Nope, they have to face the entire voting public and justify their economic management to everyday people. Second, shorter election cycles. Australian federal politicians face the electorate much more frequently, every 3 years for the House. That means the window between spending the money and facing the music is already highly compressed. Adding a strict, career-ending fiscal disqualification rule into this already intense pressure cooker, that would be absolutely explosive.
Section 5. Australian Reality. The Economic Context. Now, thought experiments are great, but what does the actual data tell us? We have to impartially look at the numbers. And there is a massive extra wrinkle to this whole conversation. Australia's debt situation is simply nowhere near America's scale. While the U.S. federal debt sits at over 120% of its gross domestic product, Australia's federal gross debt is much, much lower by comparison. Now, does this mean the thought experiment is totally irrelevant for Australia? Absolutely not. Deficits, structural spending pressures, and managing the long-term budget are still major, ongoing, and heavily contested debates down under. But the immediate existential panic about a spiraling national debt that clearly drives Buffett's original aggressive idea in the United States, it just doesn't quite match the current Australian economic reality.
Still, distilling all this political theory into a clean, plain English Aussie translation, it basically reads, if Canberra runs the country too deep into deficit, the government loses the right to stand again. It's very Buffett, it is very blunt, it essentially boils down to sort your shit out or you're fired. It perfectly, emphatically captures the entire essence of attaching ultimate, unsparing accountability to fiscal management.
This brings us to a final question I want to leave you with today. Is attaching immediate personal consequences really the only way to ensure long-term fiscal responsibility? Can we trust the standard democratic process and everyday voters to appropriately manage national debt, or do we truly need drastic structural rules to force politicians to look beyond the next election cycle? It's a remarkably complex issue with no easy answers, but deeply understanding these incentive structures is the first step to unpacking it all. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.